Loading.
Bonjour, Monsieur.
Herr Stub, wie geht's Ihnen?
Ah, paar Mal.
Hey everyone.
Everyone, thanks for joining. So we will just wait a couple of minutes to let other people join. We will likely start by 9:05.
Thanks. Hey, do you know if there was a recording for the last meeting?
I may need to double check with Russell. So last time I missed that, but I think Russell may have like a robot that like record that one. I will post that to this talk if it's available.
Yeah, just checking. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi everyone, since it's 9:05, so let's just get started. So I will start with some highlights happening in the past 3 weeks. So the first is that we add the context awareness response parsing support in the REST client. Thanks Prashant for doing that. This will be necessary to let the client to incorporate the casing sensitive information, for example, and get prepared with the scan planning APIs. Second highlights will be to support configuring the user agent in the HTTP client. So now the client could put some information about its user agent and to help the server for auditing and debug. And thanks Prashant for doing that. And we also add an option to config some TLS settings in the REST client. Thanks Brian for doing that. We also have two short bug fixes. The first is to now we allow the page token. We actually fix a bug to improve the pagination logic to handle the null page tokens, especially for the first page. So now for the first page, you definitely only need the page size, but not necessarily to pass in any token. So thanks Alphas for fixing that. And we also have a bug fix that catch illegal argument exceptions by decoding the GWT. Thanks Ning for the fix. And finally, we have an important fix, which is a critical issue in the REST client. So this happens when the server receives commit updates, and it applies updates to the persistent, but the client receives a 5xx error responses, and the client make a retry, and then it finally results in table corruption, because the client will then receive the conflict and tries to delete all the metadata. And thanks, Prashant, for fixing that. And I believe there's also a discussion thread in the dev list talking about how should we make this either a patch release or we will do another release for that. So we will keep the discussion there. Okay, so those are the quick overview of the highlights. And now let's move on for the topics. The first topic is the event endpoint proposal calling for additional feedback. I will leave to Kevin. Do you want to?
Yep. I can do that. Yeah. So Christian is out. He's on vacation, but he's asked me to gather some feedback from the community just so that we don't have a churn for 2 more weeks. This is recorded, so he'll probably be watching this too at a later time. But yes, I think we've talked a couple times about this topic. People have added their comments to the docs. So just wanted to open up the floor and see if there's any additional comment on this. And there's an associated PR as well. It's in draft right now, but I think if all goes well and we're all satisfied with the proposal, we can move forward with that one too. Any comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Apologize. I kind of missed following the events endpoint proposal a bit. I have some comments I put in the doc and saying one sentence it says support audit, but in the next sentence it says, no, we can't really. So, but my biggest concern is actually that metadata, like the full table metadata, is included for every event operation that happens on a table. And considering that a full table metadata can become really huge, like many megabytes, I think that's, at least for me, a concern with the size of the payload that's received by consumers. So I would prefer to remove the metadata itself from the events API. The other concern about having metadata and properties on namespace updates is that metadata itself can be considered sensitive information. And I would like to use the analogy of log service SaaS offerings, where people are really cautious about what they put in their log messages. And we don't know who consumes these events. And putting sensitive information in a system that's not controlled or could be at least surprising. And I'm a bit concerned about that.
Yeah. So for the first one on the size of the metadata, did you already added that as a comment to doc?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Let me delete today. So
yeah.
So
maybe early in the morning for you.
Gotcha.
If I can jump in here quickly, Robert, it seems that the table metadata that you're referring to is only there now for create and for register tables. All the other actions are now only update objects only, which I still find somewhat reasonable. Now, I still have the same concern that you have, at least for register table, right? We may not know how big this table metadata is for a table that already exists. And so I'd made that comment. I'm not sure that it's gotten Christian's eyes. It's still on the GitHub PR as well. And there's not been really a response for it for almost 2 weeks now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like from update, for table updates or the like, or metadata updates in general, it's still a concern that it could contain sensitive informations.
Yeah.
And let me add one more point there. I think we are aiming to allow a couple thousand commits per minute. So just mentioning a number out of thin air. But considering that these things can be big, and given that filtering criteria might not match the actual use case, there could be a payload issue and saturating network bandwidth and such. So I would be careful with what's been put in the event object in the single event, and considering what's actually needed, and also considering, okay, what's sensitive and payload size and whatnot.
Yeah, I hear you, especially on the sensitivity of the data. The way I'm thinking about it is that there will have to be some sort of permissioning behind who's able to call this API and who's not. So I feel like that's more of like at least the way I see it as an implementation issue of the catalog itself, in terms of how do you make the permission model to allow this to happen and things like that.
Yeah, but then you don't know who the consumer is. That's the thing. It would be a service. So, and if the service is like a SaaS log service, where if they have a data breach, all your sensitive information is exposed. It's a bit concerning for me.
Yeah, fair. I can see the point. I think I'm still not as concerned. I'm still very concerned about the table metadata part. Totally agreed there.
Hey, Anand, you mentioned in the previous conversation that you added a comment and it's hasn't been addressed in 2 weeks. Are you talking about a comment in the docs or
On the
somewhere
GitHub draft PR?
on the GitHub draft PR? Okay, I see.
It's only related to the register table API, right?
That's correct. I mean, I put that we went back and forth once. So create table I'm okay with at this point. Um, well, somewhat okay with. But yeah, I feel like there might need to be something done. Either make it an optional field or something, right? In case that this metadata object is way too large. But yeah, something or another, or some recommended way of dealing with a large table metadata size needs to be kind of recommended there at a bare minimum.
Yeah, I'm curious about the sensitive information, the metadata, but I'll just take that offline.
It's basically that you consider the content of your schema as confidential information. Some people do.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But does IRC specifies a role-based access control in the specification? So how is the data hiding concern of IRC in the current state? Because I can load a table, right, using the same argument.
That's a different user. That's basically Prashant accessing the table and not like some event service bot, whatever.
Why can't event service bot have a user in my system without events being in public?
That's not the point. You have no control over what this event bot does with the data. Does it expose it to some statistics information? Does some AI thing learn about this and expose it in some unrelated context? You don't know.
No, but sorry, I'm just trying to understand. Is the concern that this event API is a public API without any authentication, we'll allow access to it? Or what exactly is the concern?
The concern is that it's stored somewhere and it contains sensitive information, what could be a surprise for users. It's the analogy of a log SaaS or log service SaaS offering.
Yeah, I capture that as a feedback. Thank you.
What?
So I got the size of the metadata, sensitive information, and permissioning for the who's allowed to basically access the event API. Are there anything else on this topic? I know we have a couple more. I don't want to take up too much time here.
So, but I have to call into question the concerns about like the security aspect of that, because that's all behind whatever authorization system the catalog decides to provide and whether they actually produce results for this endpoint. So like that's the security questions I don't think really apply in terms of like sensitivity of the data. You can either protect it or you can make it available. You can manage it in the same way that you manage access to any endpoint or data underneath tables. So,
but the point is, it's not an optional field. So you have to expose, or you don't expose events at all.
Which field is not optional? What are you saying is not an optional field?
Metadata, table updates, view updates, namespace properties.
Yeah. So if there's concerns about security over that, you apply security to it.
Yeah, but you can't. Then you have to shut down the whole events endpoint.
Well, you could say the same thing for the table endpoint, table load metadata.
No, I think the story is different there. Because if I do a load table, I do it as my user. So it knows it's Robert loading that table.
Says
but
who?
for events,
that's not part of the spec. Like access to the events endpoint has the same requirements. Like it comes like you can impose requirements about identity, who has access to read the event endpoint. It's no different than any of the other endpoints.
I don't agree with that.
Can you explain why that is? I mean, because we don't define anything as part of the spec that would say that it is a user or there are certain requirements about how you access those endpoints. And that's true for all the endpoints.
I mean, if the community decides to do that, I'm fine with that, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that needs to be there.
Robert, can you address the point though? He's asking you a specific technical question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I already answered that, but I think yeah. Can I continue? Thank you. So I think there's no disagreement that schema itself can be considered sensitive, right? If you allow a service like event service that captures data somewhere in some way, that then gets access to all sensitive information, and you basically lose control of what that event consumer does with that information.
I mean, you're mixing up though the security aspect of things, which we're saying is largely out of scope for the REST catalog, right? Load table has all that same metadata information, right? Scan plan provides access to, information behind the scenes. Like there's all sorts of ways that if you ignore security from an implementation perspective, yeah, you would have a problem. But I think what we've said consistently is that like security is something that needs to be applied on top of the specification. So I don't see how this is any different than any of the other endpoints that we have.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. That for load table, we can have a different security implementation. Say, okay, you can load table with read privilege, and you can load table with write privilege. But this is not a spec concern, and it's more about the implementation concern from the catalog side. Flowers had these privilege. Say, okay, you can read table, you can write table. These are different privileges, but that itself is not a inside IRC spec. I think just like the other any endpoints, we don't try to put the privilege or access control on these endpoint level.
But the catalog, so I see that Laurent also added something to the comments, which was, hey, but this is exposing everything. Implementation can define the behaviors around that. So a catalog can look at the identity that's coming through and only return a subset of events that individual should be able to see if you wish to do that. These are all implementation details. Like there's no limitation that's being put on the spec about the security aspects of how you would implement this. We're just saying there's a mechanism to represent these things. Dimitri?
Yeah, thanks. I generally agree that this is an implementation detail. However, given the point that implementations may need to look into the event type or specific table that the event is associated with, would it be reasonable to include that in the event endpoint parameters so that filtering could be, access control could be applied upfront before doing any heavy lifting if it happens later? Like, for example, if you're asking for an event for table X, it's different from asking for an event for table B or Y. That's what I mean, right?
Yeah, I think that there was like a separate discussion about like the whole filtering aspect of things. And we've got a lot of different use cases that people are talking about in terms of what they might use events for. But I think we largely scaled back the complexity of it initially because we were getting into very complicated things about, well, how do we represent filters? What kind of expression syntax do we use? Like it gets into this rabbit hole of complexity. And so I don't think that that's necessarily something that we would not be able to add later. So the question is, like, do we actually need that right now in order to get kind of the first initial set of functionality? Laurent?
Yeah, to follow back, I think I see that as an usability problem because there are like two use cases. I think like in the federation use case or like the replication use case or the audit use case, like the expectations is that like having a stream of events is considered like kind of like a privilege operation, like using like your security team or like your obviously like automated process, which you consider secure if you want to replicate. And that's not really an issue, but like if in the case of like I've seen like the webhook, like being able like to follow like a specific table as an end user, I think that's where like there's like this extra complexity on the access control to be implemented by the catalog. And I mean, yes, it's a catalog concern, but like if like no catalog implements like that type of fine-grained access over the events because of the complexity of the performance reason and stuff, then I think like the API is missing one of its goals. So
I think that there's a question to be asked about like, well, how complicated and what kind of use cases do people have, for this versus like going to the extreme of like trying to handle every hypothetical scenario. Like if we're talking about federation, it's very likely that the implementation would have some sort of system level user that you would hook up between catalogs and it would be tracking those events and updating the catalog. And this would not be like a user facing feature that users are going and tracking things. Mm-hmm. The same thing could be said true for a scheduler or something like that. It would have some sort of service principle or system principle that would be used in order to watch events to trigger actions. So all of that is an implementation detail. And that seems like the easiest for people to implement is saying like, hey, if you're a system user or we set up our permissions to say that you have like event log access, like that's an escalated thing that encompasses all the information that could be passed through. And then those implementations could further refine that implementation to say, I can understand the identity and I can prune the results that I'm going to send back just to what that identity should see. All implementation details.
Which is fair. So I just bring back more like I like usability that like this API may not be accessible to anybody. Like the same way like get tables is, right?
Yeah, and for like an enterprise implementation, I would strongly suggest people look at that closely, like what information are you exposing, who do you expose it to? But I don't think that necessarily gets to the level of like, we need to change the specification in order to accommodate something around it. Robert?
Sure, there are legit use cases why someone might leverage getting the metadata directly or the table updates directly in that event stream. However, I could imagine that people become very creative. Even enterprises become quite creative at use cases. So maybe it's an option to say, okay, I don't give that one the ability to even get the metadata in the events, and make those fields actually optional. This could also help with things like, yeah, I want to filter on a specific namespace and get all the things recursively, which is kind of tricky. So I have to get all events. And I'm not interested in all the events. I'm only interested in a namespace and its children, or its children, like recursively. If I get then an option to say, okay, don't give me the metadata and I save like 5 gigabytes per request, that's fine.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have Christian here. So hopefully he'll watch this and we can pick it up next time.
I think he will.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
I'm sure
any
this way
other
it's-
comments?
Maybe you can just capture the proposal in the feedback so we can catch up.
Yep.
Oh, this is recorded too, so he can.
Yeah.
He can
Yeah, it's recorded. I've added some notes on the doc. Let's keep moving. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm pretty sure this one is recorded, and I'll upload the recording after this meeting. So let's move to the next. Is the Dremio Auth Manager donation. Alex, I will pass it over to you.
Sure, thanks. Hey, everybody. So you probably saw my message on Dev mailing list yesterday about this donation, but just to summarize the idea for those who didn't read it. So at Dremio, we've been developing an alternative auth manager for a while, and it has been open sourced a few weeks, maybe months ago. And so we received some early feedback from a few users and customers, and we think that it's probably time to move forward with this project and propose it to the Iceberg project. So today I just wanted to check in with you. Did anybody read the email, has an opinion about that, or questions about the project or the donation? Anyone?
I actually didn't see it until now. So maybe you could give a quick summary of
Yeah, that'll be great if you. I
Sure.
skimmed it.
So yeah, so the idea it's been a while that we've been receiving some feedback from customers that say we have problems with token refreshes, we have problems with external IDPs, and indeed the built-in auth manager has some shortcomings around those things. And so when we got this feedback, the idea, we thought we can either try to fix everything or implement a different, propose a different implementation. But given that the built-in auth manager is in Iceberg core, it's very difficult to make it evolve, right? Like if you think about token refreshes, how could we propose a solution for the problem? You cannot change it because you're probably going to introduce a regression and break a ton of catalog servers out there. So you probably would have to go with the flag to enable an alternative behavior, but that from a user perspective is probably not great. Another example that I could give is authorization code. We have lots of users asking for this feature, but authorization code is not just a simple request and response cycle. It's a lot more than that. It's actually a stateful flow. So you need to do all the steps in sequence and keep some state in between. So how would you implement that in Iceberg core? That's also very difficult, right? And the third example I could give is our customers are also asking for things like client assertions. But for client assertions, the client needs to generate a JWT and sign it. So we're probably going to require a third-party library. But how can you add a third-party library to Iceberg core without, creating a ton of problems? So all these questions came up, and then our solution was actually to propose an alternative implementation, and that is the Dremio Auth Manager project. It's completely Dremio agnostic, by the way. I mean, there's nothing specific to Dremio there. It's just about OAuth, all about OAuth.
Is this based off of the auth manager interfaces and things that we introduced a little while ago?
Yes.
So it
Yes.
fits all under that current
Yes.
API.
Yes. You just switch the implementation, and yeah, we already have users doing that.
Yeah, because I'm mostly interested in terms of like if we were to have a different implementation of OAuth, because there's already like an implementation, and I would assume that like this new implementation doesn't have all the same behaviors as the existing implementation, right? So it's like it's a separate version of OAuth.
Correct, but we introduced the notion of dialects. So this thing basically speaks to dialect, the Iceberg REST dialect, which is basically the same behavior as the built-in manager, and then the standard dialect. So it makes migration easier.
Well, so
basically.
then I guess the question is like, if we already have one that speaks to the Iceberg dialect in the Iceberg project, what we're really looking forward is the
it's the standard one. Yeah.
The standard piece of it.
Yep.
So we could introduce that as a separate auth manager that sits alongside the other ones that we have, because we have like there's another auth manager that's in review as well for like GCP related auth.
Exactly. Exactly.
With this one, well, so even that one has like specific like Google behavior things that they're looking for in order to like work appropriately with the clients and the environment and stuff like that. So would this subsume that, do we think, or is this another one that would sit alongside?
I think for now it would be another one, because the GCP Auth Manager uses the GCP SDK to contact the token endpoint. So it's a different client, whereas our Auth Manager actually reuses the REST client given by the catalog. So it's more tightly integrated into the catalog. It also speaks context and table sessions, which is not the case of the GCP Auth Manager.
Do we have a PR for this, or are we just like proposing to discuss?
No, this is just the start of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think it would be confusing to me to introduce another Iceberg flavor of the Iceberg, OAuth, and then we would have two Iceberg ones and then a standard one. So I think we probably want to split that out and just lean into Iceberg reference having the Iceberg implementation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Who's next? I think it's Kevin first.
Yeah, I've kind of a naive question. So as of right now, if I'm running a catalog server and I have some clients, and if I want to use the new auth managers that's proposed, do I have to change the server side, or is this a client side protocol only?
It's a client side thing. You just add a new jar. Like if you're using Spark, you can add a packages instruction or jars instruction.
Yeah,
and go from there.
I guess the improvement is just some quality of life over the current OAuth implementation that's in Iceberg Core.
Yeah, that and more features. We support a lot more flows and security aspects like PKCE or client assertions, as I said.
I see. Yeah, I think on the Python side as well, some started working on making the auth manager customizable. You can pick and choose. And we're starting to add on that. And I guess one more comment is SigV4 part of this conversation? Is the way I look at, or as in, is SigV4 a quote unquote custom auth path, or this is solely just OAuth we're talking about?
Yeah, this is purely OAuth. So SigV4 is a different implementation of the auth manager for SigV4.
Right.
So right now we have the auth manager APIs, and then we have a SigV4 implementation and Iceberg OAuth implementation. We're proposing a standard OAuth implementation, and then there's like the GCP flavor of OAuth too.
Yeah.
Good thing we have standards, so we can have 3 different versions of it.
Yeah. And I'm sure there will be more coming, so I'm interested to see how this plays out.
Who's next? I think it's Robert.
Yeah, basically just a technical note or thought. I mean, if the GCP one really requires the Google SDK, that would just be a runtime dependency, and it would only work if you have the Google GCP stuff on the class path. So maybe the code of the Google OAuth stuff could be in the auth manager, and it would just only work if you have the Google SDK on the class path as well.
That's how
it's probably mergeable. Yeah.
So the GCP one And like if we had a standard one, it probably would work with GCP, but the client libraries actually do some things like look for the JSON representation of the credentials in the correct locations within your environment, and very like to contact the instance metadata service to get credentials, like things that are not part of the standard but are like standard in the GCP ecosystem. And so I think that that's why that particular flavor is being introduced.
Absolutely. Laurent?
Yeah, so first, I think I got my answer, like why Google, like they're looking for ADC support, which is application default credential support, like automatically detecting local credentials. I wanted to point out that like also like OAuth, it's a spec that is versioned. So like when, I mean, like 2.1 is being released, but there's a lot of extensions. And I think for me, that's what I'm looking for, I guess, the OAuth manager, but it's extensibility, because there's a lot of discussion from a security point of view on making things more robust, and that's where you have like all the discussion. And one big discussion these days is like about like proof of possession, when like there's like a client can generate like some type of token and is able like to sign all requests. So like I think we need to think. I mean, I hope like we can think that as like an investment on the long-term strategy running security of OAuth, and not just like, oh, we implemented OAuth and we are done, because like they just keep adding. Last time I checked, like the OAuth like page, like the list of all the RFCs on OAuth has like I think like 20 of them like currently like taking addressing various parts of the protocol. So is that like a fair goal, like for the Iceberg REST catalog, like to be able like to seemingly like adapt new OAuth standards, like to improve like
I would think that that depends a lot on what we're using those extensions for, right? The thing is, like, if you take the simplest view of this, which I think is what a lot of catalog implementations are doing, they're not doing the Iceberg flavor like token exchange and things like that. And without that, this is actually a very basic OAuth. With the exception of like handling the flows and things like that, it's a very basic implementation, largely just using bearer token across all the endpoints, right? So I don't know which extensions you're looking at. I think we'd have to look at those specifically, like as they come out.
Like I mentioned, like FPOP, like basically when the client is generating its own assertion, and then like during like when you're obtaining the token, there's basically like a protocol to like so that like the token is bound to the assertion you just created, and then basically you can sign all the requests. So you know that like basically like even if the bearer token is leaked, it cannot be used because you're not able like to sign any request coming from the client. But something we're starting like our customers are getting question about. I'm not saying like that's like that top priority, but like that's definitely on their radar. And like we even have like potentially flows when you do like full token exchange with like a customer IDP which want to exchange their token, which also an assertion into like our own systems, authorization systems, and they want to be able to cascade that up, even like sometimes to the data storage, meaning like some of the attributes they are creating, they want to be able to validate that, like for example, on S3 IAM policies. So we see more and more like credential-less zero trust constructs when people want to be able like, to create like a chain of trust, a full chain of trust as strong as possible.
Yep.
Gavin, I think you're next.
Yeah, I think I was just looking at, as of today, how we pick and choose OAuth or different, auth methods. Is the goal moving forward that it is customizable, and like, for example, as a Spark client, I can specify, either the Dremio one or like the Iceberg Core one or SIG-V4 or something else? Is that kind of part of the goal here, is to be able to do that?
In a certain way, it's already possible. You can plug in any auth manager that you want. But your question is very good, because OAuth is a bit special because it resides inside Iceberg Core. So you don't need to add anything special. to get OAuth authentication. But if we donate this project, where is it going to land? Probably not in Iceberg core, right? So we need to start thinking about where it should live.
Yeah.
And in this case, how would users be able to activate this auth manager? It probably will require adding more dependencies to the runtime jars, for example, Spark runtime and Flink runtime. Yeah, all these questions we still need to start thinking about those.
Yeah, I was just go ahead.
Since you brought that up, like, what is the level of dependency that we have for this? Is it basically a native implementation, or do we have like third-party?
It's almost zero dependency. There's just one dependency. For client assertions, we decided to actually rely on a library, Auth0, to generate and sign the JWTs, because it's really painful to do this manually. But all the rest is natively implemented. So it's a tiny jar.
Yeah, I was just looking at, you know, what we do currently today to specify SIG-v4. I think my question ultimately comes down to, in terms of the UX, do we want to follow the SIG-v4 pattern, or should we do something that's different and maybe more customizable? I don't know, some just like something to think about.
Go ahead.
Can I just inquire? Like, I'm trying to understand like so right now, when you configure your catalog implementation, you define which security type you want to use, right? It's either like none, OAuth, or SIG-v4. So like, what are you looking for that would be different from that?
I guess let's say this is a flavor of OAuth, right? How can I pick and choose which flavor of OAuth?
Oh yeah, I mean, so that's an open question. Like, it may be OAuth standard or something like that, or you know, we make it distinguished from the original OAuth in some way.
Yeah.
But I would think that we would just name it something different.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question is, I lumped SIG-v4 as an auth mechanism similar to the different flavors of OAuth. So does it make sense to say I will choose OAuth and then a flavor of OAuth, or I choose SIG-v4? Or does it make sense to say, you know, I choose SIG-v4, OAuth that's in Iceberg? You know, like having two levels of decisions, like OAuth and then blah, or just SIG-v4. I think that's just what I was wondering about.
I don't want that.
Okay. No, I'm wondering what's the better UX, right? Like, is it that, or like, you know, I pick and choose?
Under the current model, we'd probably just register it under a different name, and people would choose that name.
Yeah. So, for example, then if I have another auth type, right? Do we want to allow another kind of SIG-v4 thing to be as part of the library?
I mean, if there are other ones out there, like you could imagine that there's Kerberos, which we haven't seen yet, and I hope nobody
bring it back.
But like, yeah, like it's just another implementation, and these are all just effectively like named mapped implementations of the auth manager.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think when I look at SIG-v4, I always have thought of it as a standout. So I was just wondering if we want to like bring that kind of back in line with like OAuth, or just allow it to be there and, you know, continue add in that fashion. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I know there was a bunch of people with their hands up. My last question is, you know, like, what can we do to help, I guess? Is there an ask here?
I would say if we want to move forward, the first thing is to start thinking about where this auth manager would live. Is it going to be a separate repo, the same repo? If it's the same repo, in which location exactly, so that I can start preparing, you know, the work. And sorry, and then there's the legal aspect of that. And I talked with JB yesterday, and he offered to help with that part. I don't know who's next. I think it's, I don't know, Laurent maybe.
No, it's Robert.
Oh, it's me. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm getting back to what Laurent said, that the OAuth standard is actually extended like daily, in quotes. But also considering that there seems to be demand for Kerberos, maybe, hopefully not, or SIG-v4. I think that should be quite a thought before deciding or for deciding where it should live. Should it be in the main repo? Then it's tied to the Iceberg core release cycle. Speaking like that, or should it be in a separate repo and it could have a different release cycle, which could mean users could use a newer SIG-V4 with their older Iceberg version. Similarly for potential new RFCs. It's just a thought, just a spark of a thought. Handing to Laurent.
Okay, thanks. So I just wanted to reply back to Kevin on the UX aspect. Like first, maybe like it's not so much like the catalog really like in charge of doing the auth operations, like but really like that's delegated to another system called the authorization server in auth parlance, and the catalog is what they call like a resource server. You may have multiple auth mechanisms supported by an authorization server depending on your context. If you're like in a user browser context, like what user agent context, you may want to support like three-leg auth, like with because like that gives the authorization server the chance to actually check the context of the user. If you're like in a service to service, that's where you're looking at like the basic client ID, client secret that nobody likes, but like everybody supports. Then maybe like over like token exchange or like over client assertions, over mechanism. That doesn't really help, like when you need to say, but like which one I need to use. But they also like specs part of the OAuth protocol about like metadata documents, and we could decide that actually like catalog implementation should expose those metadata endpoints. Like one is basically like for resource server to actually point to where is their authorization server. And then there's like one for authorization server, which is like, hey, what type of mechanism do you support? And so then you have like a list, and like you may have like also like the parameters you may need to set, which helps, for example, like the client to make the determination on what should I use.
I don't know. I guess my initial reaction to that, it sounds like if you want to support that, you support that external to anything from the specification, right? I mean, it's mostly a matter of does the client know how to interact with that?
Yeah.
And,
it's the client like being able to do the discovery and interacting. It's outside of a spec, which I think is a good thing. Like initially, like each time, like on the Iceberg REST API, when we mentioning like security mechanism, it's a bit cringy because like they should be at an external level. I know that like the open API document is a bit phrased that way, but like yeah, it's better like to be left to a different level in my mind. But
I think like my overall reaction is if it's standardized, it's something that we should be willing to at least, consider supporting as long as there's reasonable use cases and we're not getting into like fringe areas of the OAuth spec that are like very narrowly implemented or only adopted by, certain vendors or things like that, where getting off track from kind of like the open source narrative.
Yeah, surprisingly, like the OAuth conversation really ramped up with like the MCP, the rise of MCP servers, when the MCP protocol, for example, mandated at some point like dynamic client registrations that almost no one supports. Like for those not familiar, it's basically for the client to just say to connect to an authorization server, say, hey, just create me an account, like, and don't ask me who I am. And like nobody wants to do that in enterprise context because like you already want to know who you're talking to. And so they kind of like roll back on that, and like there's a lot of discussions on things on like how to, in a highly distributed system, when you have a lot of services calling each other that trying to access the same data, like how you can basically chain or like share the same authorization. So there's a lot of, that's why like OAuth is getting a lot of visibility these days. So I'm expecting a lot of changes, and some things like like becoming super popular and the way like most people we adopt OAuth, and some we like on the fringe side of things.
So I guess maybe Alex, for follow-up, like, are you at a point where you could make a pull request so we could see a little bit more about like what this would entail? I think there's the open question about, would it live in core, or does it need to live in a separate module? As long as it's not like overly complicated or has lots of dependencies, which sounds like it probably doesn't, like I would almost rather it live in core than having to set up a new module for it, and we can just like put it under a different packaging.
So in Iceberg core, because it's roughly 200 files.
Oh, that is not a
Yeah.
small implementation. So
No.
that gets us to a harder question about like, well, how
Yeah.
do we go about doing donation? Because what is particularly difficult is taking on large code bases just as a dump. We need to, validate things, get reviews. Like 200 files is a large contribution.
Yeah. So no, I don't have a pull request ready right now. Also, it's a whole repo right now. So if you're going to transform it into just a module, that requires some thinking. There's a core module, and then there are a bunch of test modules, and then some, let's say, secondary modules that we could maybe get rid of. But yeah.
I mean, to confirm also, like correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but like all the development has been done in the repo. Like there's the full history. Like it's a few people contributed that. Like all.
Correct. I think the clearance part of the job is going to be relatively easy, hopefully.
And on Dremio side, because that's Dremio code, like at least the copyright says so. I mean, we don't have any IP attached to that. Like, I guess it was like from the get-go, like with the intent of like donating that code, and so we just reconfirm like we have no. I mean, doing a code donation is no issue at all. So for us on our side.
Okay, thanks, guys. Sorry, I dropped a little bit, but now it seems we can move to the next item, which is the interoperable FGAG proposal. I'll hand this over to Robot, Dimitri, Alex, Laurent. Any one of you want to take this over?
I can maybe start and hope that Laurent, Dimitri, and Alex can chime in. So yeah, so this effort is going on for quite a while now, mostly internally. Sorry. We've been thinking a lot about how FGAG in with Iceberg and Iceberg REST could work, and ran into quite some at some point nitpicky detail discussions about technical details. And we thought like, yeah, let's look at that from a like very high level view, and the actual proposal, which is intentionally very high level, and leaves out quite a lot of the technical details, just to focus on the actual concept. One of the main drivers is basically interoperability, which means that the goal is to have any query engine working with any catalog. Both need to be FGAG aware, of course, but any query engine can work with any catalog, and as long as the catalog trusts the engine, you hopefully get what you want, meaning ensuring that all the rows that shouldn't be seen by a user are not seen by a user. Similarly, for updating requests, yet you can't update rows that you're not allowed to update, and data transformation, which I use as an alternative term for data masking, also works properly. It also leaves out details on the actual authorization system type, meaning, okay, it doesn't explicitly mention OAuth in the document as a prerequisite. So you could add any Amazon one, or you could add Kerberos if you like to and want to go down that route. So that proposal leaves that aspect open. This goes as far as that you should not be able to put anything that's really authorization system specific down to a catalog or even to a query engine. The other aspect is like separating or properly separating sensitive information. Like you don't want to have all the claim values available to the actual query, and that's basically that's what this approach roughly wants to achieve. And the goal here is really to focus on the concept, not on the technical details. So there's no Iceberg REST changes intentionally there, but it's meant to be part of Iceberg REST.
Yeah, I guess as far as Iceberg REST is concerned, I guess what Robert means to say is that it's going to be like the next stage of this conversation. If we agree on the conceptual approach to how FGAG is to be done, then the next phase will be figuring out the exact REST interface changes.
So I think my concern with this, and what has come up multiple times with the whole idea, and I see that there are references to the prior conversations and discussions around, policy definition or enforcement, FGAC, is that it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, in that, the challenge we had when we go and we talk to engine implementers is that they don't necessarily agree on policy or semantics of what certain things mean. And we don't have a standard language in which we can define and enforce policy. And if we go and define something, then engine providers may balk at that and say, no, we're not implementing it. And so it's kind of like, are we forcing people to accept a policy, or are people actually agreeing on a policy and we're just implementing an interface to exchange that? And I don't think that we're in a place right now where it's particularly clear that people agree, which makes it kind of difficult to go out and say, hey, this is the policy that we think everybody should enforce. So I haven't read through the doc. I have not actually seen it yet, other than just like skimming through it. But I think my concern is really around, like, how do we get from the point where we define something to the point that we think that that's actually going to be well received, and there's general agreement by all of the engine providers that they would actually support something like that.
May I try to answer, I think, this question? I agree with you. Like, and I'm sure we'll be a lot of back and forth. There's, like, for me, like, two parts. Like, there's the policy aspects is similar. Like, the policy as configured by the customer is similar to the permission system you put on the catalog. And you may see, like, and I don't think we will agree easily on, like, what the policy should look like on the catalog side of things and stuff. So that's why, maybe the focus on that effort is specifically on the communication between the catalog and the client about, like, the effective transformation to apply. And I think because it's more like it's a narrower scope, it may be easier to have things. And we can also, like, imagine starting smallish, like, and then expand. I think that basically we will have the same discussion we had, like, for views or for EDFs or for things of, like, hey, like, what about my use case? And, like, and hopefully, like, we can focus on the protocol. Like, that thing is optional. Like, there's, like, the trust component, meaning, like, if engine don't support it, see, like, it just means, like, customer will have choice, but, like, we're not forcing everybody to implement that. But, like, I hope that, like, we can evolve and do, like, proof of concept, so that, like, people can chime in and get more familiar and, like, and decrease at least the concerns on the communication between the catalog and the engine. The conversation on the policies are managed by catalog. I think that's interesting. Each catalog could have their own conversation, but as long as we all agree that, like, when, like, how things should be exposed by the Iceberg REST catalog, like, to the engines, that makes, like, a easier discussion to have in that forum.
Yeah, and to add on to that, the idea is not to force a specific dialect or a specific representation of the policies. The idea is to literally separate the policies from the what's called protection instructions mentioned in the document, from those. And these are just binary or SQL representations or whatever that tell a query engine or give the query engines an opportunity to pull those into their query plan. So that becomes natively executable by these query engines, doing the optimizations they want, things like this.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. We have a certain discussion around the community, even the data lake community about the FCAG and policy versus another direction's policy decision exchange. I think one of the reference point like AWS RISE is how we exchange policy decision instead of that we exchange policy. So basically, we discuss a lot about two options. One is we have a policy in the catalog level, and you can share this policy across catalog, across engines. This discussion has been this has been discussed a lot, but turns out it's pretty hard to exchange policies. Each individual catalogs and each individual engines have its own flavor and its own preference to have its like the policy format. They don't necessarily understand each other. And if we were trying to unify them, I think it's up here effort. So the next one, the second option we discussed a lot is the how do we exchange the policy decision? Let's say the catalog can still have its own dialects of a policy like OPA, Ranger, or whatever the private formats within that catalog. But when you try to image the things to the engine side, you image the decision instead of the policy itself. This will reduce a lot of burden from the engine to be compatible with all kinds of different policy formats, right? Engine, we can potentially kind of narrow down the scope to only a small set of the rules which engine needed to adopt. This is a very interesting perspective. Like this, I think multiple option has been proposed, like secure views or Iceberg expressions, and I didn't see any. So we don't have any solid proposal at this moment, I think. But yeah, I think this is a very interesting area. From this, I just did a brief look at this proposal. I didn't see any, like maybe just a very dumb question. What is this proposal mainly about? It's about policy. How do we write the policy on the catalog side, or how do we exchange policy across multiple and between the catalog and the engines?
So I think, I mean, Robert, you can follow up, but like for me, this spec, I mean, is all about like, I mean, document shared with like the Iceberg is all about the Iceberg REST catalog protocol changes, which right now I think in the document we don't really put. So we need to add that section. So, I mean, like we just I guess wanted like to test the water. And then like we will keep working on the Polaris side of things to discuss like the policy work, and so how Polaris, and hopefully like the discussion will converge. Like we still have it back and forth, but like I think like on the Polaris side, like it was like initial implementation, like with basically like piggybacking on views, which for me has like some issues, and so I really wanted like to see like how amenable the Iceberg REST catalog people were to like an evolution of the protocol to expose that before going too far on the Polaris side. So
Yeah, this is I'd like to follow up on that. So the idea is not to define something new or invent something new, and the clear difference here is that engines get just something in substrate representation. You could do CatSet, maybe not a great option, but it's possible. You could use SQL snippets and push those into your query plan. So the query engine literally does not need access to the policies, which also hides sensitive information. So the actual interpretation or execution of these protections, code snippets, or transformation filters, those are literally made by the catalog, which knows who you are, which access you have. Is that query engine trusted? Whatever that. And as long as that's done, then the catalog gives the engine the instructions how a particular table or view has to be protected. And these are literally basically filters or expressions in the SQL sense or in the substrate sense, which makes it pretty easy for engines to implement that. So engines do not need to interpret policies. Engines actually don't have access to policies, and they don't need it.
Quickly, I would like to add, actually, it's more than just like would not need. It's like it's on purpose. I think like in the model, we actually do not want to expose any information related to the identity of a user to the engine. Like the engine should not make any determination based on like the username or the groups or stuff. Like all of that should be handled by the catalog, on the catalog side of things. And really like what the engine get is just the final transformation to apply on data.
Yeah, I guess that actually matches, at least as far as I understood what Yufei was saying. It kind of matches Yufei's idea about communicating policy decisions, right? So in my mind, that becomes a question of how we express those decisions, right? So I see that in Robert's document, that is the term used is, I forgot the term. Policy something, oh, come on.
You mean protection?
Protection.
Yeah, protection. Yeah. Yes. I guess that's the same thing that Yufei meant by policy decision. And I would say, like, I mean, substrate is an option. SQL is an option for sure. I sense that what Yufei mentioned might be a bit more narrow. Like if we want to just enumerate a specific subset, like for example, if value matches, then exclude, right? Kind of like exclude include rules. I think that's an option that is worth consideration depending on how the engine community wants to. I would say that this question is more like we need input from the engines, what they prefer to implement, like a new spec for like a narrow set of conditions that they need to incorporate into the query plans, whether they are good with the substrate, whether they're good with SQL fragments. I think it's more kind of like engine preference.
Okay, so it seems like
Yeah.
since we are out of time, so I will just call the end, and please let's continue the discussion over the design doc and all the dev main list. Thank you everyone for joining this meeting. I will post the recording when it's ready. Awesome. Thank you so much.